The Great Emu War, A Soldier's Account, Western Australia. November 1932. Private Tommy Walsh had survived the trenches of France. He'd faced German artillery, poison gas, and the screaming chaos of no man's. He'd earned his medals, served his country with distinction, and thought he'd seen the last of military operations when he was discharged in 1919. Now, 13 years later, he found himself crouched behind a rust-eaten water tank in the middle of the Western Australian outback, clutching a Lewis's gun and staring at his most formidable enemy yet. Emus, thousands of them. "This is madness," Tommy muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. The November sun beat down mercilessly, turning the wheat fields into a shimmering golden sea. Beside him, Major Meredith raised his binoculars, surveying the battlefield with the same intensity he'd once used to spot enemy positions. "There," the major whispered, pointing to a group of about 50 birds moving through a devastated wheat field. "Wait until they're in range. We'll cut them down before they know what hit them." Tommy had his doubts. They'd been at this for 3 days now, and the emus had proven to be far more cunning than anyone had anticipated. But orders were orders, and the farmers were desperate. The birds had destroyed thousands of acres of crops, and with wheat prices already in the gutter thanks to the depression, these men were facing ruin. The emus moved closer, their long necks bobbing as they pecked at the scattered grain. They were enormous creatures, some nearly 6 feet tall, with powerful legs and an unnerving intelligence in their dark eyes. One bird, larger than the rest, stopped suddenly. Its head swiveled, scanning the horizon. "Sentinel," Major Meredith breathed. "They postcards remarkable." The sentinel emu stared directly at their hiding spot. For a moment, Tommy could have sworn the bird was studying them, calculating. Then it let out a deep, booming call that echoed across the empty land. "Now!" the major shouted. Tommy squeezed the trigger. The Lewis gun roared to life, spitting bullets across the field. For 3 glorious seconds, it seemed like they might actually succeed. Then the gun jammed. By the time Tommy cleared the mechanism, the emus had scattered like water thrown on hot stone. They split into small groups, zigzagging across the field with surprising speed. The few birds they'd managed to hit struggled briefly before falling, but the rest vanished into the scrubland, as if they'd never been there at all. 50 rounds, the major said grimly, checking his ammunition count. "Maybe a dozen kills. This isn't working." Over the following days, they tried everything. They mounted the Lewis gun on the back of a truck and chased the emus across the rough terrain. But the vehicle bounced so violently that Tommy couldn't aim, and the birds icily outpaced them on foot. They set up ambushes near watering holes, but the emus seemed to sense the traps and sent scouts ahead. They even tried herding the birds into a box canyon, but the emus simply split up and ran in different directions. The worst part was how resilient the creatures were. Tommy had seen birds take 3 or 4 direct hits and keep running. Their thick feathers and tough hide absorbed bullets that would have dropped a man instantly. One emu ran for nearly a quarter mile with what should have been a fatal chest wound before finally collapsing. "They're like the German infantry," Tommy said one evening as they made camp. "Except faster and smarter." Sergeant McMurray laughed bitterly. At least the Germans didn't have guerrilla tactics. But that's exactly what it felt like. The emus adapted to every strategy. They learned to associate the sound of the truck engine with danger. They began traveling in smaller groups that were harder to target. The sentinel birds kept watch from higher ground, giving early warning to the flocks. It was as if they were fighting an organized, thinking enemy. The newspapers got wind of the operation after the first week. Tommy saw the headlines when they drove into town for supplies. "Emus win battle against soldiers." One paper ran a cartoon showing an emu wearing a German Pickelhaube helmet, standing triumphant over a pile of empty bullet casings. Another article quoted a member of parliament suggesting that medals should be awarded to the emus since they'd won every round so far. Major Meriting was furious, but there was nothing to be done. The numbers didn't lie. They'd fired nearly 2,500 rounds and killed maybe 50 birds. The farmers were grateful for any help, but at this rate, they'd run out of ammunition long before they made a dent in the emu population. On November 8th, the order came down to withdraw. Tommy felt equal parts relief and shame as they packed up the Lewis guns. Relief because the whole operation had been a nightmare. Shame because they'd failed. But the emus kept coming, and the farmers kept losing crops. 4 days later, they were about. The second campaign was different. Major Meredith had studied the enemy and adjusted his tactics. They moved more carefully, spent hours in position waiting for the perfect shot, and focused on ambushes rather than direct assaults. Slowly, painfully, the kill count began to rise. Tommy learned to respect the emus in a way he'd never expected to respect an animal. They weren't just dumb birds, they were survivors, adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth. They could go days without water, run at speeds that would exhaust a horse, and survive injuries that would kill most creatures. In their own way, they were as formidable as any enemy he'd faced. By early December, they'd managed to kill nearly 1,000 birds. The major claimed it as a victory, but Tommy knew better. There were still tens of thousands of emus out there, and every day more arrived from the interior. The ammunition was running low, and the soldiers were exhausted. On December 10, 1932, the military operation officially ended. Tommy and his unit packed up their equipment and headed back to Perth, leaving the Lewis guns silent at last. Years later, Tommy would tell the story at pubs, and people would laugh. The Great Emu War became a joke, a story about government incompetence and military failure. But Tommy never laughed. He'd seen those birds up close. He'd watched them organize, adapt, and survive against machine gun fire. The farmers eventually controlled the emu population through bounty systems and better fencing. Life went on. The wheat grew again, but somewhere in the back of Tommy's mind, he could still see that sentinel emu standing on a ridge at sunset, watching them with those dark, intelligent eyes. He'd fought in a real war against human enemies with all their terrible weapons. He'd survived and come home, but he'd always remember the war. He lost the one against an enemy that couldn't be intimidated, couldn't surrender, and refused to be conquered. The war against the emus.